Hey, everybody. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about career choice and some of the issues that crop up thinking about the ethics of work. And I've got over here to the far side Karl Marx. And so I'll, mention briefly some of his ideas. And this is Elizabeth Anderson. She's a really great, just amazing professor of philosophy at University of Michigan. And this is her most recent book, Private Government: How Employers Rule Our Lives. And so she's no Marxist, that's for sure, but she is worried about way a lot of people get treated on the job and whether they're treated morally or not. And then I've got another book, Just Work by Russell Muirhead. So if you're interested, those are some fun books if you're interested in thinking more about work in our country. And so today what I'm going to do is talk about some of the issues that came up in the article you read about meaningful work. And so the first thing I do is I just pulled this off the internet, some statistics, and people more and more talking about meaningful work being valuable. And so that's one reason I thought it'd be fun to just go over this and talk about what different things people mean when they talk about meaningful work. So they'll say employees who find their work meaningful are 69% less likely to resign. 9 out of 10 people are willing to forego percent of their lifetime income for a meaningful career. More than 80% of millennials take work-life balance into account. Now we've got millennials and Gen Z. 79% say they would be more loyal to their employee if they receive recognition. So we've got some statistics here about what people are thinking about work today. And what I'll go over today is some of the different things people have in mind when they talk about meaningful work. And so if you read the article, you might have noticed from that it's sort of a buzzword in business. And so there's this question, what is meaningful work? And that's one of the things the author of the article, Michelson, digs into. So he starts out with this thing that some boss or some CEO saying, he says, I want your shower time. He likes the idea of people when they're taking a shower or commuting or they're off work, technically, they're still thinking about work and trying to strategize about what to do. And so one question is that a dream or a nightmare? And that's one of the things that goes through this is that on the one hand, if you had a job that you loved and you were so into your career that you really were excited to think about it off the clock, so to speak, that would be a good thing, right? Most people think they love to have a career they're really passionate about rather than something that they hate and can't wait to get out of their mind. On the other hand, if you're thinking about this job all the time, it seems like there's been erosion of kind of a work, personal life, leisure boundary. And so I think in the end of the day, Michelson comes down on thinking that it'd be better to have one of these careers they're passionate for. One thing I won't get into is the role of technology and the way that that's, I think, made people a little more worried about invasion of the work life or erosion of the work life boundary. But what he brings up is that you could evaluate work, first of all, just from the point of view of your well-being or what's good for you as a worker. And first of all, you could just look at things like objective quality of working conditions. So on page 15, he's got a nice list here of things you might worry about. Was it free for you to enter and leave the work? Can you quit the job at will? Is there honest communication on the job, fair and respectful treatment? Is it intellectually challenging? Is there independence to determine the work methods? Is there democratic participation in decision-making? Is there due process and justice when you have complaints? Is there fair competition to get employment? So there's lots of those issues that have to do with issues of corporate responsibility for labor standards, and in some cases, even human rights claims. And so those are all aspects of a workplace you could be on the lookout for. And he has a nice little list there. You could get interested, obviously these would be things that most of you just might already be worried about. And so he points out, you might think wanting more than that might seem like kind of a luxury because, there are people in the world who are taking really crummy jobs they can't get out of. They might not have safety at their workplace. And so he thinks there are these sort of baseline conditions that most workers want and would benefit from. But one thing to know is that you can't just take for granted that your job is going to do well on those fronts. And that's the theme of Elizabeth Anderson's book. And I've got a link to in a podcast. You can listen to her talking about the book. up on Blackboard. And here's a quote from her. She says, there are images of the free market society that were very attractive and they made sense prior to the Industrial Revolution. And so you might think that it was nice when the governments and the traditional lords and aristocrats couldn't tell everyone what to do anymore. There were these people who were serfs, right? They didn't have freedom. So the market brought freedom instead of state control or control through traditional statuses like being a lord or a serf. And so, but she thinks there's kind of a mismatch between background social assumptions reigning in the 17th and 18th centuries and what's going on today. So she thinks a lot of us, you might think of the free market freed us up from a certain form of bondage we were under conditions of sort of medieval serfdom, and people had a lot more freedom, right? There's social mobility. You can put yourself on the market to see what you want. But her point is, if you look at what it's actually like to work in a lot of workplaces today, she thinks it's sort of like there's a private government ruling your life. And so she mentions, what else would you call the modern workplace where superiors can issue changing orders, control attire, surveil correspondence, demand medical testing, define schedules, monitor communications such as social media posts. And so that's a theme of her book, is that if you look at the way that a lot of people are treated by their workers, by their employers, it's really like a dictatorial government, basically. And so if you thought the state started acting that way towards us, we'd all rebel against it. And yet we seem to just take it for granted that this might be how our boss would operate. So again, you might think it'd be better if your workplace was more democratic and accepting, and your boss was not dictatorial in relation to you. And those might be there might be moral objections to those kinds of workplaces. So, but in addition to those objective conditions, there's also just more subjective meaningfulness conditions that you can meet at work. So in addition to just having a workplace that's safe, you're not getting harassed, there's certain kind of freedom on it. But then there's this question of, does it provide meaning to you? And so here, what Michelson does, he brings up this example of Paul Gauguin, the famous painter. And his point in doing that is, so Gauguin famously was an investment guy. He was doing well and he was supporting his family in France, and he just hated his job, right? He did not like it. He didn't like working in that industry. He didn't like his boss, maybe, but he was providing for his family. And then he really wanted to be a painter. And so what he decided was the only way he thought he could be a painter is he just had to ditch this job, ditch his family, and take off for Paris, and then later go to Tahiti. That's the caricature story anyway of Gauguin's life. And so then he went to Tahiti and became one of the founders. I mean, it started in Paris, became one of the founders and most famous artists in the modern art movement, and was hugely successful. And the idea there is that one of the things that might have driven someone like Gauguin to quit this job in finance that paid him well and enabled him to support his family was he found it meaningless. He thought it was just nothing. There was nothing in it for him. It didn't love him back. And so you might think this is a case where what this shows, well, first thing Michelson thinks this shows is that when people say they want a subjectively meaningful job, they're not just talking about they want to get paid well, okay? Or that it's of a certain social status among certain people or something like that. It's sometimes something more amorphous, where a lot of people will talk about wanting to find their calling or something that they're passionate about. And so you need to think about, if you think that if you're drawn to thinking about work that way, it would be smart to think about, what exactly do you mean? What does that amount to? The idea of looking for a meaningful job that you have a passion for, and how could you realistically go about trying to find a job like that? And so again, he thinks it is maybe a kind of luxury that a lot of that people like getting education you guys are all getting, and I had. A lot of us in the United States, we're in relatively fortunate circumstances in the globe, and so we might be able to shoot for subjective meaningfulness. And he also thinks that could be a good idea if you can get it. So, but then the other component of this is that he brings up, you also could evaluate work based on the impact on the worker's quality of life. That was the first thing. But the second thing is going to be the ethical impact of your choice. So one question is, are you going to have a good workplace that's going to meet certain criteria for being a good, fair workplace, equitable workplace, things like that? your boss isn't an evil dictator type, pressuring you to be servile, we talked about earlier. So hopefully you don't have one of those situations. And so that, but then even if you don't, you might then also want meaningfulness. Okay. And those would be things that would be good for you about a career. But then there's this other question about the ethical impact of your choice. And so one thing you might think about is ethics, the ethical impact on people in general. And so this is where this guy, Norman Care, suggests that there's a common conflict a lot of us are going to face when we're picking a career in our society, Western societies, and that you can either pick work that offers you personal self-realization, he says. You might think that involves something like this idea of meaningfulness for you. Or you could have work that enables you to provide service to others and serve others. And he thinks there's just often this change, this challenge. And in Care's work, he also talks about just even on individual jobs. If you go to law school and you're getting your law degree, I know KU students who've done that. I know students in other departments I've worked in who've done that. But I'll keep in touch with. And they, as you go along, you have to decide what area of the law do you want to go into, or what area of medicine, or what area of nursing, or something like that. If you're starting a business, where do you want to work? A lot of times, the choice to do something that seems like a real service-oriented dimension of your field, that will come at lower pay, often, maybe lower status, but it may also give you less in the way of meaningfulness or self-realization. They may be more stressful jobs with less joy, for example. That's not always the case, but Care thinks that's the common challenge, and you're going to have to decide when you're looking at these, which one do you think is better? And again, you can think in terms of utilitarianism, which one is going to promote the most good in the world? Or you could think in terms of Kantianism, which kind of job will allow you to treat other people as end in themselves. And so that brings up sometimes a self-realizing career looks like it kind of cuts against morality. It might involve immoral things. And so that brings us also to the second thing, which is brought up by the Gauguin case, is your career and the way you relate to your career can impact your relationships and responsibilities to your parents, if you decide to have kids, if you have a partner, your friends. So how do these things fit together? And is there a sort of tension between pursuing your passion and your self-realization and having a career that enables you to fulfill these roles well? And so that's the classic thing of work-life balance that most people run into later in life, certainly if they have families, but even if they don't. And so that can be one of the real challenges there, is that you might feel there's sort of an ethical duty you have or responsibility to people in your life, your parents or your family. But then that can cut against, even if you have very good works, right? Might have work that meets the subjective, meaningful conditions. That's great. Even that might conflict. But another thing to think about is more structural issues about how kind of facts about injustice play out. And so that's been really salient during the pandemic with, if you look at the percentage of adults with children age who have stopped working due to COVID-related childcare issues, women have really taken time off work a lot more than men. And there's a lot of evidence that women in general are going to have a huge setback in terms of pay equity and other things. And so there's a lot of those other decisions that if you have jobs, sometimes that can just be, well, it could be an economic decision, right? So that could be part of the issue here, is you could be looking at you're bringing a certain amount of money to the family, you might have two incomes. How are you going to decide ethically what the best thing to do is for the whole family? On the other hand, some people may be less willing to give up their career if it's one that's quite meaningful to them. So that can be a big challenge to give up. If you have a career that's very meaningful, you have to give it up and maybe take a job that's less meaningful, or take a break from work and say be a stay-at-home parent, which may be less fulfilling in the short run, as from the last reading. So these are some of the issues that come up that are just the kind of ethical dilemmas that you can expect to face surrounding work and impact on your relationships and responsibilities. And so that some of these are going to be kind of unavoidable, like with the COVID, right? But there's still going to be tough decisions to be made. In other cases, you might have to choose, say, work-life balance. Do you want to put your career and your own self-realization ahead of what you might think of as your ethical obligation to your kids? Or do you want to, put your kids first and do the opposite of what Gauguin did and maybe stick with a crummy job you don't like that puts food on the table? So that's kind of ethical challenge you get. in there. And so amongst that, it's a kind of case you want to start thinking about, what do you think you should do when you have to choose between your own self-realization or happiness or meaning and some ethical demand? Where do you want to draw the line? So one thing I'm going to ask you on the think sheet after today is going to be, so I'll do think sheet at the end. I'm going to ask you, what do you think was right or wrong in this Gauguin case? Could it be permissible for someone to ditch their family in order to go and have a much more meaningful job, even if that meant their family was not going to have support in the same way? And so another thing think about is, what impact will your career have on your moral character? And so one thing to bring up here is the idea of compartmentalization. And so there was a philosopher, Alistair McIntyre, who had a lot of interesting stuff on this. And he did actually empirical experiments with psychologists. And there's been following work on this. And so you might think compartmentalization could be a good thing. So you might think having your time where you're at work and your time in public, your time with your family, maybe you go to church, you might have sort of keep your values and focuses. You're able to sort of juggle all these and be into these different roles that you have. But the question is, what are your core values and your core moral values, and are they really expressed in all these different domains? And so one worry about some jobs is they will encourage you to not ask too many moral questions when you're in the job, because you're just focused on making money or increasing productivity. Don't worry about the means that you're taking. Bracket the moral stuff. Just think about what's going to succeed in the market. But then you can think about morality, say, when you're with your family. And so McIntyre argued that a lot of our contemporary social institutions, including work ones, they encourage you to compartmentalize different parts of your psychology and your values, and not really think about that on the job, what kinds of the morality of what you're doing or not. So if you think there are jobs like that, or maybe you've had a job like that, where on the job, for whatever reasons, you're encouraged to just go along with immoral behavior and not ask too many questions, you can worry about how that's going to impact you over time. And there are other things. Obviously, then you could have a job where you're engaged in moral activity, and you might think that's a bad impact on your moral character for sure. So those are some of the issues that come up in these debates about what meaningful work is. And so you could say work could be considered meaningful because it contributes to other people and the greater good of society. It could be considered meaningful because it enables you to fulfill your role obligations to your children or your parents. And it could be considered meaningful because it gives you that personal sense of meaningfulness. And a lot of the psychology that's been playing out in businesses now is encouraging businesses to think about that feeling of satisfaction is important, because then people who are feeling a lot of satisfaction at work and who are really jazzed and passionate about their work might work harder, be more productive, and that could add to the competitiveness of the firm. But you do also, when you think about a meaningful career, you want to think about these other issues about other people in your life, work-life balance, things like that, and also the larger question about social contribution. And so what we'll be doing next is turning to questions generally about how moral you want to be. And so that could come up both with a question about having kids, also in the case of work, and how moral do you think is important for you to be? So you have to figure that out once you've already made your decision about what you think morality requires. So summing up, if you think back to our earlier units, in terms of the quality of a job for you, you could think about what would maximize your pleasure. You might think about the hedonist ideas of achieving some kind of peace of mind. And a lot of jobs are pretty stressful. They might make that harder to accomplish. What will enable you to maximize value fulfillment? And so you might remember back to the stuff from the early Tiberius piece. She talked about that philosopher, Cheshire Calhoun, talked about different ways you can spend your time. And on the job, are you spending your time doing things you value for their own sake, or are you doing things that are just instrumental to some larger purpose? And then you can ask a question about whether the job helps you develop your distinctively human potential. And so I thought I'd just mention that's behind a lot of Karl Marx's critiques of certain forms of work, is that he thought a lot of work jobs that arose during industrialization and the division of labor weren't really jobs that were very fit for human beings. They weren't ones where people exercised creativity or freedom to develop themselves and to produce products that you could see as manifesting their human creativity, their human ability to produce work that they would sort of feel affirmed by the products, by the value of them. And instead, it just focus on maybe you're one part of a big chain of people producing widgets that would be sold on a marketplace. And so he thought a lot of that job could be sort of alienating and deadening because it didn't really help you develop your distinctively human potential. And so you don't need to be a Marxist in a broader sense to think there's something right about that idea for evaluating jobs. You might think back to our objective accounts of well-being, Pastor Jones and others, and asked, do you think they have something to tell you about picking a good career? And then there's the different moral theories we talked about. Utilitarianism saying you should promote the most good in the world. Deontologists telling you to focus on your duties and obligations, including your duties and obligations to your kids and your other family members. And then you can think about the Kantian idea of treating humanity, the end-setting ability we have as human beings, the ability to adopt rational plans and follow them. And we should treat that as an end in itself and never as a means. And you could ask yourself, when you think of your job, you can think about the variety of people who are going to be impacted by the career choice you make. Clearly, you are really going to be impacted. Then there's your family, your friends, and then strangers. And so you could ask yourself, from the ethical point of view, are the impacts and the ways that jobs encourage you to relate to others and all these different groups, are these ethically good ways to impact other people and relate to them? Or is there something problematic about the impact this job will have? And then you can often say with care, maybe that those considerations will push you in one direction, whereas the well-being considerations will push you another. You might get lucky and try to find that job that hits that magic balance as best as possible. So that's it for today. And I will be back next week with our discussion of how moral you want to be and why you should be moral or not. So hope you're all having a good week. And I will talk to you next week.